guys, Mr. Lutz talking to you today for just a couple of minutes about the Columbian exchange as well as the Great Dying and the slave trade. Just intending to kind of complement what we're doing in class. The notes are really brief, so we're going to get right into them with what's been going on as a result of the Columbian exchange. So by now you've learned a little bit about what this process is and what its consequences are. The main gist of it, if I could be brief with you, Columbus comes to the New World and brings with him some things from the Old World, being Europe, Asia, and Africa. And the Europeans are introduced to a whole bunch of things that originate in the Americas and bring them back to the Old World, where they're going to have both positive and negative consequences. But I think as a generality, it's safe to say the consequences of the Columbian exchange are going to be more positive for the people of the Old World, while for the people of the New World, what they're getting from the Old World in total is going to be more negative than positive. I'm going to keep it pretty much that vague because I think we get into more detail in class, but at the bottom of this slide, you can see, just make sure you're familiar with the effects of the spread of domesticated animals, diseases, potatoes, corn, sugar, and tobacco. And after the videos that we've watched, the crash course video in particular, the Atlas activities that we've done, hopefully you're able to speak to what are those effects, both positive and negative. So moving into the topic that's more of the focus in this video, that's the Great Dying and the slave trade. We'll talk more particularly about these two developments in class, but for now, let's just try to establish some context here. So we're really going to focus on British interactions in North America, and they're going to be along the eastern coast of the modern United States. So when you think the old 13 colonies, you're thinking of the British settlements in North America. And their economic activities are going to be some fishing, some small-scale individual farming, but then some larger plantation-style farming. And they're going to be in competition then as a result of that, especially the farming establishments. That's going to lead to competition for land. But they're going to have issues with French fur trappers as well, and that'll get back to like the French and Indian War that you're familiar with, or as it's called in world history, the 7 Years' War. But key thing here is going to be basically how does European contact in the Americas impact other groups and the environment? Like we've seen, the French and Dutch are trying to be a little bit more cooperative with the natives, and that's a result of their economics. It's not a result of anything that the French or the Dutch are naturally doing. The English are struggling because they want land for agricultural development, whereas the French primarily want fur trapping, and they need people who have more experience in the land to help facilitate that. This does lead to more battles between the British and native settlers, one of which we'll study in class in particular is going to be King Philip's War. And just as in South America, like we saw with the Incas and Pizarro, smallpox is going to wreak havoc on populations in North America, among other diseases, including measles. Finally, the last thing here is just going to be the slave trade. And its impact that it has. Now, there's multiple different types of labor systems that we'll see in the Americas. We've already talked about the encomienda system, which was basically a tax that the natives paid to the Spanish in the form of their labor. They were supposed to be given protection in exchange for that, and we saw they really weren't. Another labor system is indentured servitude. You're going to be in debt to someone perhaps for being able to come to the New World, and that debt is going to be paid off from your labor for X amount of years. And then once it is paid off, you're free to live your own life. Finally, chattel slavery is what we're really going to focus on the most when it comes to the slave trade. And these are going to be Africans forced into a life of slavery, being brought to the Americas against their will, being considered the private property of the person who's purchased them, families being torn apart, people being exploited and dealing with really harsh conditions. And this slave trade, it's primarily dominated by the British, and it's going to be facilitated in Africa pretty much along the coast. That's where Europeans are going to interact. They're going to work with slave traders from Africa who go into the interior of Africa to get slaves in exchange for getting manufactured goods and gold from European slave traders. The slaves themselves were journeying as part of the Middle Passage of the triangular trade, the conditions of which we'll talk a lot about in class. And along that route, it's likely that about 20% of all who traveled on the Middle Passage, that is, the slaves traveling on the Middle Passage, would not survive that journey. And we'll also talk about the consequences of the slave trade in class. But for now, what you should know is that resistance and rebellion against slavery takes a lot of different forms. Sometimes it is pick up a gun and fire it at your slave owner. But sometimes it's singing songs of resistance or doing your work a little bit more slowly. Like, it can take a lot of different forms. And we'll talk about that. Africa is losing its most capable working population because they're forced into this life of slavery. And as Europeans are trading for slaves, they're giving guns to Africans in exchange, and that creates further political instability within the continent of Africa. But then one of the long-term effects on this part of the world is that the long-lasting influence of African culture has really made it into our society, both in terms of music and art and food, and in a whole lot of different ways. So that's really it for right now. Again, we kind of just saw the Columbian exchange and Europeans getting to other parts of the Americas other than just South America, and then the slave trade, what went on and what are some of the consequences, which of course we'll explore in more detail here over the coming days. So that's it. See you in class.